chapter 7. If you're visiting with us, that black Bible in the chair in front of you, you should find it, I believe, on page 132, 133. 133, okay. I didn't check this time, and I went, I think it's 133. So 133, you can use that black Bible. Go towards the back of that black Bible. It renumbers in the New Testament. So it starts in the New Testament with 1. So that's why I say 133. 1 Corinthians 7. 1 Corinthians 7. We're doing verses 1 through 24. And I failed to mention in announcements that we don't have the Lord's Supper, which we usually partake of the Lord's Supper. This morning, we're going to put off to next week. And there's a reason why. And I'll tell you later on in the service why I'm going to do that. I decided that this week. I think it would be most appropriate. And notice this is going to be part 1 of 7, 1 through 24. We're going to do part 2 of that next week. Let me read through these first 24 verses of chapter 7. And then we'll go into the text more in depth. Now, concerning the things about which you wrote, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. But because of immoralities, let each man have his own wife, and let each woman have her own husband. Let the husband fulfill his duty to his wife, and likewise also the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband. And likewise also the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife. Stop depriving one another, except by agreement for a time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer, and come together again, lest Satan tempt you because of your lack of self-control. But this I say by way of concession, not of command, yet I wish that all men were even as I myself am. However, each man has his own gift from God, one in this manner, another in that. Verse 8. But I say to the unmarried and to the widows, that it is good for them if they remain even as I. But if they do not have self-control, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn. But to the married I give instructions, not I, but the Lord, that the wife should not leave her husband. But if she does leave, let her remain unmarried, or else be reconciled to her husband. And that the husband should not send his wife away. But to the rest I say, not the Lord, that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever, and she consents to live with him, let him not send her away. And if a woman who has an unbelieving husband, and he consents to live with her, let her not send her husband away. Verse 14. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified through the wife, his wife. And the unbelieving wife is sanctified through her believing husband. For otherwise, your children are unclean, but now they are holy. Yet, if the unbelieving one leaves, let him leave. The brother or the sister is not under bondage in such things, but God has called us to peace. For how do you know, O wife, whether you will save your husband, or how do you know, O husband, whether you will save your wife? Verse 17. Only, as the Lord has assigned to each one, as God has called each, in this manner let him walk. And thus I direct in all the churches. Was any man called circumcised? Let him not become uncircumcised. Has anyone been called in uncircumcision? Let him not be circumcised. Circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing, but the keeping of the commandments of God. Let each man remain in that condition in which he was called. Were you called while a slave? Do not worry about it. But if you are able also to become free, rather do that. For he who was called in the Lord while a slave is the Lord's freedman. Likewise, he was called while free is Christ's slave. You're bought with a price. Do not become slaves of men. Brethren, let each man remain with God in that in which he was called. I've probably given you these divorce statistics before. Under 20 years old, the divorce rate for women is 27.6%. For men, it's 11.7%. The age of 20 to 24 years old is 36.6% is women, 38.8% is men. 25 to 29-year-olds, 16.4% is women, 22.3% is men. 30 to 34-year-olds, 8.5% is women, 11.6% is men, and then 35 to 39-year-olds, 5.1% is women, and 6.5% is men. Some have given the statistic that 50% of marriages end in divorce. That's not totally true. There's actually something new in Arizona from the Census Bureau. 11 out of 1,000 men divorced in the previous year. Is everything okay?
Yeah, we're okay. We're okay.
Okay. Is she okay? Carol, you want to take her home? Okay. Okay, thanks, Travis. Thank you. Thanks, Carol. In Arizona, this is from the Census Bureau in Arizona, 11 out of 1,000 men divorced in the previous year. That is in 2009. 12 out of 1,000 women divorced in the previous year. Now, given the population in Arizona is over 6.4 million, just under 6.4 million, the national average is actually 9 out of 1,000 men divorced and 10 out of 1,000 women divorced. We're actually higher than the national average here in Arizona in terms of divorce rate. And yet, the national average, though it's 9 to 10, it's actually higher in different places like Tennessee, Georgia, Mississippi. Those states actually have an even higher rate of divorce than we do in Arizona. Though it's not as drastic as I thought it would have been, it's still tragic, isn't it? To hear about divorce. Especially when it's someone that you know. My wife and I know someone presently right now that's in the middle of a divorce. And they're in their 40s, I think. Or maybe for you, it's tragic for you because you know someone who's going through this, or maybe you've gone through it yourself. There are distinct ways we can socially apply the gospel, practically applying the gospel. And now Paul is going to get into something even more private and personal. He's going to talk about marriage and being single and how do you deal with that. And how I title this, though, is like this. We must be a church that's committed to biblical contentment and change. A church that's committed to biblical contentment and change. And I can even give you another part to that by saying this. A church committed to biblical contentment and change in our personal lives. In the very personal areas of our lives. You can add that if you like to the title. You'll see why in a moment why I chose this title. Biblical contentment and biblical change. You'll see why in a moment. But we want to be a church, remember, we want to be a church that's committed to unity, a church committed to humble faithfulness, a church that's committed to resolving conflicts and dealing with sin in the church, and having purity within the church. Remember we talked about discipline and disputes, conflict, and also our desires. How do we deal with that as a church? Now a church committed to biblical contentment and change. Here's a larger statement for you. We are happily satisfied with where God has us in life and ready to biblically change things, if or when possible, in those personal, private areas of our lives. In particular, he's going to talk about our marital status. If there's anything that's private upon private, very personal, it's our marital status. That's very personal areas of our life. And if there's any place where we struggle with contentment and with change, it's in that, isn't it? That very area, our marital status, that's where we struggle with contentment. That's where we struggle with change. This is the most directed, extended teaching on being single and married in the whole Bible. You won't find it anywhere else. And Paul's going to say, marriage is good. Get married and stay married. It is a gift, so you can edify. You can build somebody up. Paul addressed specific ways Christian men and women could glorify God with their bodies. To maintain healthy / intimate relations with others / spouses to help avoid immorality / adultery and prostitution. Notice the connection. Healthy relationships with others to avoid immorality. Intimate relations with our spouses so it keeps us from adultery. So how can you keep yourself pure? Paul's going to say, get married. To the married, keep having relations with your spouse. If you're single, then live contently in the situation of life you find yourself in, which God has placed you. Retain the present place that God has called you to, that God has given to you. This is where you are right now. This is God's call. If you can change your status biblically, then go do it. Otherwise, remain. Biblical contentment and change. And where we will begin is not verse 1 yet. Go to verse 17, actually. Because it's striking to me, which I'll bring up later on, it's striking to me why Paul puts this section in here. He says, only as the Lord has assigned to each one, as God has called each, in this manner let him walk, let him live. Look at verse 20. He's almost repeating himself. Let each man remain in that calling in which he was called. This actual word calling, kalao. And then almost verbatim in verse 24, brethren, let each man remain with God in that in which he was called. He's repeating himself. Why? What's he saying by this? Here, live contently in any situation of life you find yourself in which God has placed you. Retain the present place that God has given to you. If circumstances by God's providence brings it about, you can change your circumstances biblically, then go do it. Rejoice in God's providential ordering of your life in wherever you find yourself. Again, if circumstances by God's providence brings it about that you can change circumstances biblically speaking, then do it. Remember, our circumstances here and now are not ultimate. It's not ultimate. So there's no need to feel desperate to change your circumstances, but then there's no need to feel indifferent either. So we shouldn't go extreme. I gotta change my circumstances. We don't need to feel that. But then the other flip, oh, I've done better. You know, there's two different extremes. Be confident, but not prideful. Be confident, but don't feel sorry for yourself. Engage in our circumstances and know that they're not permanent. Okay. So which personal areas specifically is he going to talk about where we need to have biblical contentment and biblical change? What in our personal lives? There's 6 of them, technically actually 7. Mind you, Paul will get into your kitchen. And he's going to rearrange all your dishes and throw out the dishes he doesn't like and buy you new ones. And if you're a woman, you're starting to bite your nails. He's going to do what? Yeah, and then he's going to take out your oven and he's going to take out your microwave and put in whole different ones and totally rearrange your kitchen. That's what he's going to do. Can I emphasize this enough for you? You get what I'm saying? He's getting in your kitchen right now. Number 1, here's the first way. Different personal areas to change, remain. Number 1, if you're immoral, get hitched. If you are being immoral, get hitched. Stop messing around. Go get married. Verse 1 and 2. You like that, get hitched? You guys like that. I thought you would. It just sounds so bland. Be married. So what? Get hitched. That sounds stronger. Notice, now we go to verse 1 and 2. Concerning the things about which you wrote, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. This is what they wrote about. It's good that a man doesn't have relations with his wife. That's what they wrote about. That's what they said to Paul. They wrote to him about this. It was good for a man not to have intimacy with his wife. In other words, they questioned if a husband and wife should be intimate. Is this God's will? This is not spiritual. Spiritual. It seems somebody was teaching strict asceticism from intimacy, especially if it was for pleasure. Don't do that. Somebody was writing about it. It was going throughout the church. Notice what Paul says in verse 2. But because of immoralities, let each man have his own wife, and let each woman have her own husband, i.e., get hitched, get married. Marriage should take place because immorality was present. Each man, each woman should go get married because of sexual temptation. If you want to get rid of immorality, then go get married. Duh. And here, I'll emphasize this. It will be important later, especially next week. Immorality refers to intimacy with no marriage. Two people outside of marriage. I believe that that's what he means by fornication, immorality. Adultery is different. It's distinct from adultery, which you see both terms used in chapter 6, verse 9. Fornication and adultery. Those are two distinct words for a reason. You'll see why I believe this is important next week. Singleness can be dangerous, though. Singleness can be dangerous because of temptation. So, it could have a devastating effect upon you. It can have a devastating effect on you spiritually. You want to keep yourself from immorality? Get hitched. Go get married. So that's number one. If you're being immoral, here's a personal area. Immorality, get hitched. Number 2, intimacy. Make it vital. This is for all you married people. Intimacy. Make it important. For all of you who are married, make it important. Make it vital. Verse 3 through 5. Talk about getting in your kitchen. I'm not getting personal, but Paul's going to get personal with you. Notice, verse 3, that the husband fulfill his duty to his wife, but likewise also the wife to her husband. He argued against forced asceticism, withholding intimacy from each other. Don't withhold these normal conjugal rights from each other, because that is not the way to serve one another in the marriage. Remember, from last week, married Roman men, they would have intimacy, sexual relations with people other than their wives. Remember that? It wasn't uncommon. Unless it's for the purpose of procreation, then you go with your wife. But if not, have at it. Paul will say, no, let your wife fulfill those needs. Husband, you fulfill the needs of your wife. Wife, you fulfill the needs of your husband. Look at verse 4. He goes further. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband. And likewise, also the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife. Husbands, you have an obligation to your wives. Wives, you have an obligation to your husband. Taking some ascetic stance is just not biblical. So, I'll get in your kitchen. Make sure you're regularly engaging in intimacy with your spouse. God made it this way, so fulfill your obligation to each other. What you're supposed to be doing. The wife's body is not her own personal property. It belongs to the husband. Now, you're talking to a patriarchal society here in the first century, so the guy will say, oh yeah, that's right, there's my body. But notice what he says. Husband, your body does not belong to you, it belongs to the wife. And the wife says, that's right. I mean, this is a big deal. The husband's body is not his own personal property. It belongs to the wife. That's a big statement for this patriarchal culture. That's countercultural. Do you understand that? Did you know? One writer said this. Did you know that in the secular world, on the wedding day, it would be declared to the new bride that when her husband committed adultery with another woman, it was not a sign that he didn't love her, but he was simply gratifying his desires. Can you imagine the new wife? Okay, I love you too. Yeah. No intimacy with others. Intimacy with your wife alone. And notice, some were depriving each other. That's why he says in verse 5, stop depriving one another, except by agreement for a time that you may devote yourselves to prayer and come together again, lest Satan tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Some were depriving. They were practicing some sort of celibacy even within marriage. That is nonsense. It's ludicrous. That is not healthy. It's not biblical. Married couples, listen to me. You need to talk about this openly with each other. Depriving your spouse is not God's will for your marriage. That's forbidden. You need to talk with your spouse about this. This is important. If it wasn't important, Paul wouldn't write about it. Intimacy was given by God for procreation as well as for pleasure. You give love. It brings such satisfaction to satisfy your spouse. Give yourself for the edification of your spouse. Opposed to what our world thinks, God is pro-sex within marriage. Because he gave sex for marriage. It's for partnership. It's for procreation. It's for pleasure. And you know what it does? You know what intimacy does? It points to our relationship with Jesus as a church. I don't understand that, but it points to that because somehow we are one with him. If you misuse intimacy, we trash God's sweet gift. When it's misused, and it is misused all the time. It's important. It's very important. It's not just for procreation, but for pleasure. Go enjoy your spouse. There's a command from Paul to you. Go enjoy your spouse. And notice he said, if you have to cease, do so, notice, by mutual consent, right? For a specific purpose and a specific period of time. What's the purpose? Prayer. How long? He don't say. Make it short, though. Right? He said, make it short. Let me give you just by way of reference, okay? If you went back to Exodus chapter 19, the people were going to see God appear on the mountain there, Mount Sinai. And the Lord said to Moses, tell a man you're not supposed to touch a woman for 3 days. So if they were going to see the Lord and they were only going to stay for 3 days, you probably should make it longer than 3 days. I mean, that's just a suggestion in terms of that. But whatever, notice, he doesn't give an amount of time. He does it on purpose because he doesn't want to get legalistic here. Because you have to do it by mutual, because you have to talk about it. And then make sure you devote to prayer, but then make it short, man. Why? Because come together again, else Satan will tempt you. He's very crafty. There can arise a lack of self-control. These desires are natural. They're God-given. Go enjoy your spouse. If you're married today, do that. That's what you should do. That gets you in the kitchen, doesn't it? You kind of go, oh, that's really personal and private. Yeah, it is. Number 3, singleness. Paul is going to say, be like me if, I couldn't put that all right there. I should have put that there. If possible. Be like me if possible. If you can do it, be like me. That's verse 6 and 7. Some say when he says, but this I say by way of concession, not of command. Some say he's talking about what he just said in verses 3 through 5? I don't think so. The command that he gives in verses 3, 4, 5, it seems very clear. I think he's talking about what he said in verse 2. Let them marry. And then in verse 7, I wish that all men were even as myself, I myself am. However, each man has his own gift from God, one in this manner and another in that. That's what I think he's talking about. In other words, marriage is desirable, it's part of God's plan, but it's not necessary. You don't have to get married. Well, I'm not married. Am I in sin? No. You're not in sin. God gives each one his or her own gift. And the gift is to be used to benefit others, not to benefit ourselves. Singleness is a personal gift from God to an individual as a way to benefit others. He's going to talk more about this in verse 8. It's a gift for edification. Now, I don't think he means spiritual gift. Does he mean that? No, because not necessarily, because he's going to talk about that in chapters 12, 13, and 14. But it's definitely something that God gives. But he doesn't just give it to Christians. It's a gift he gives to different people throughout the world. It's to Christians and non-Christians. Singleness. They just don't have that desire. It's just not there anymore. I'll give you an example. There's a music director at a megachurch. I won't name the megachurch because they don't know who I'm talking about. It's a megachurch, and he directed music at this megachurch. I think he's probably close to being in his 70s now. So I think it's been about 40 years he's been doing this. He's been single his whole life. He's almost in his 70s, he's been single his whole life. And I think the pastor asked him about just not being married. And he said, well, my sex drive is equivalent to a plant. Okay, some of you are not processing that. Maybe it'll come later for you. Okay. Okay, some of you are laughing now. Okay, good, that's good. Okay, now you're figuring out. Yeah, that's what he said. That's why there's just nothing there. Singleness is a gift. And then, by the way, I want to make mention of this here. Many have said that Paul was never married. Have you heard that view? Yet it's interesting. Jewish men who were devoted to his Torah study and studying as Pharisees, to be Pharisees, they were almost always married. Almost always married. And so it's quite possible that Paul was actually widowed. I actually read something 2 months ago on a blog where a guy goes through a states a case where he thinks that Paul is actually widowed. But whatever the case in point, Paul's saying, look, if you're single, be like me if possible. Okay? Now, number 4, to the unmarried and the widows, either stay where you're at or get hitched. That's where you get stay or hitch. Okay? And that's verse 8 and 9. But I say to the unmarried and to the widows, it is good for them if they remain even as I stay. And I want to make mention of this when he says the unmarried and widows. I believe he's talking to those who are never married and widowers and widows. I don't think he's talking about those who are divorced. And I'll speak about that later. There's a reason why I don't believe that. But his point is here, all of you are unmarried, widows, widowers. He says, it is good for them if they remain even as I. So stay like that. It kind of goes back to what he said on the third point that we have, singleness. If possible, if you can do it, be like me, Paul. Stay single. Stay single. Yet if you can't control yourself, go get married. Don't burn. That's where verse 9 comes in. If they do not have self-control, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn. For some, it's going to be hard. If so, then ask God for a spouse and then enjoy intimacy with that spouse. Okay. Question. What if you are burning, but there's no one you can marry? Then what do you do? Well, I think it means that God wants you to be single right now. And he's giving you that gift for right now. You might say, but I can't control myself. Yes, you can. Else you would be married, right? just means you need to trust God more. It just means you need to trust Jesus more. Who will give you the grace to stand firm? At this point, I want to make mention. Have some of you committed sexual sin already? Maybe you have committed sexual sin outside of marriage already. Listen, there is sweet forgiveness in the cross. There is sweet forgiveness in the cross. Run to Jesus. Be cleansed. And now stay pure. And that's the beauty of the gospel. The beauty of the gospel, because God should punish us, right? God should punish us for our immorality. God should punish us for our thoughts. God should punish us for the things that we do wrong, for the thoughts that we do, for the things that come out of our mouths. He should punish us. But God, though he should punish rebellious sinners, Jesus took the place, right? He lived where we failed. He was perfect. And then God poured out, the Father poured out all his wrath upon Jesus. He was a substitute. And then he resurrected from the dead. And if you're here this morning and you're not a follower of Jesus, repent. Repent and trust in Jesus. Turn away from your sin and trust Jesus. Turn away from immorality and trust Jesus. You will find forgiveness and mercy and grace. Run to him. Don't run away. Run to him. You'll be cleansed and you stay pure now, okay? It calls us to a new way of living. So, unmarried to the widows, stay where you're at or go get hitched. Now, number 5. The married. So you say stay. Remain unmarried or be reconciled. I know I kind of put that jam-packed in there. I'll have a statement for you that unpacks a little bit more. Because here Paul is going to talk about Christians and divorce. And first he's going to deal with Jesus' direct words. In verse 10 or 11, to the married I give instructions, not I but the Lord. The wife should not leave, and that's connotation of divorce. If her husband, if she does leave, let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband. That the husband should not send his wife away, divorce them. In Roman times, divorce was very common. Most marriages ended before the death of a partner. So Christian married couples, they would need to be countercultural. So he says, here's the statement, to the married, don't divorce your wife or husband. If you do divorce, remain unmarried or be reconciled to your husband or wife. Divorce should not happen at all. That's what he's saying. Reconcile because God has so reconciled with us in the gospel. We read from Mark chapter 10 this morning. And then as a congregation. And then in Luke chapter 16, verse 18, Jesus says everyone who divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery, and he who marries one who is divorced from a husband commits adultery. And Jesus' words are very clear. This is important because as God is reconciled with hell-bound, rebellious sinners who hated him, we need to be more than willing to reconcile with a spouse. Notice how the gospel is the thing that drives us to reconciliation. I mean, how can a person say, I'm so much closer to God, but I am going to go ahead and divorce my husband or my wife? That doesn't make sense. It's an oxymoron. You can't do that. The gospel is a foundation of the marriage because the gospel is a picture of marriage. Now, mind you, does it mean we discount your pain? No, we don't discount your pain. Do we discredit the issues that you're dealing with in marriage? No. Does our Lord say this flippantly? Absolutely not. I think Jesus, the all-knowing God, he knew exactly what he was saying when he said what he said there in the first century. Malachi 2:16, God hates divorce. Now, I'm only going to deal with our passage that we have in front of us this week. Because next week, I'm going to give you my personal viewpoint on divorce and remarriage. I'm not going to spend the time to do that today. I think it's a whole other subject. It's related to this, obviously, but there's so much other verses I want to bring into this. So I'm going to hold off on that for next week because we have much ground to cover. So again, those who are married, stay married. If you do divorce, remain unmarried, or go reconcile to your husband or wife. Now, number 6. To those who are married now to someone unsaved, be peaceful. And that's important, that now, because here you had this couple going about their marriage, and all of a sudden, blam, one gets saved. The husband gets saved, or blam, the wife gets saved. Now he gives words Jesus did not speak directly, but are nonetheless biblical. God-breathed commands by Paul, verses 12 through 16. What do you do with these mixed marriages? What does a wife or husband do when this one comes to Christ? So it means there seem to have been mixed marriages there in the Church of Corinth. One was a believer, one was a pagan. So if my unsaved spouse was threatening to leave, what should I do? Make him or her stay? Should I throw him out? Get out of here. You're unclean. That's what I'm supposed to do. Maybe some were saying they were unclean. And maybe some were saying, you need to get out of this unholy union that you have right now. But Paul's going to say that's not a reason to dissolve a marriage. Malachi 2:16 still comes into play. Notice what he says in verse 12. To the rest I say, not the Lord. Any brother has a wife who's an unbeliever, and she consents to live with him, don't divorce. 13, a woman has an unbelieving husband, and he consents to live with her, don't send him away. So what's he going to say? Well, first of all, if you are a Christian, you should not marry a person who's an unbeliever. First, foremost. If you are a Christian, you should not marry a person who's unsaved. Second, if after you were saved, your unsaved spouse is willing to stay with you, don't throw him or her out. Continue in the marriage because God has ordained marriage as a lifelong bond. Just because she or he is not a Christian, it gives no grounds for divorce. That's not a ground for divorce. Well, he's not a Christian. Well, she's not a Christian, so I'm going to divorce him. No, Paul says. And notice how that goes both for the wife and the husband. You see that? So you stay, whether or not the unbelieving husband or wife, if they freely consent and approve to live with the unsaved, stay with them. Stay with the unsaved wife. Stay with the unsaved husband. And keep in mind, keep this in mind as you're writing this down, keep this in mind for the wives. Here's a wife who comes to Christ. She may have a non-Christian husband who will continue to engage in intimate relationships with others other than his wife. Remember, that's the Roman culture. You remember that? So he might consent to live with her. And she, no, I'll stay married to you, but then he continues to do this. What does she do? Stay married. Endure this and make yourself available to your husband. And make yourself available to your wife. Here we go. Listen. The ordinance of marriage is given by God for all of humanity, not just for Christians. So it's better to stay married than to seek a divorce from an unsaved spouse. And then he gives the reasons why. In verse 14, which is, it's a weird verse. It's a weird passage. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified through his wife. And the unbelieving wife is made holy, that's the word, through her believing husband. For otherwise your children are unclean, but now they are holy. What in the world does that mean? Let me tell you what it does not mean. It does not mean the unsaved spouse and children are saved now. It doesn't mean that. Or it doesn't mean that they benefit from some covenantal status. It doesn't mean that. does not mean that she or he are going to heaven now, and the kids. It does not mean that they experience some moral transformation by the spouse. It does not mean those things. One writer put it this way: holiness is more powerful than impurity because of the sanctifying influence of the gospel of Christ. What does this mean? She or he, the saved spouse, can have a godly influence upon the unsaved spouse and upon the children as well. They will have been blessed. The blessing of the gospel, the blessed influence of the gospel. They would receive a greater witness as opposed to having no gospel witness at all. The benefits of Christ's blessings would flow to the unsaved spouse and the children. Because this husband or wife loves Jesus and is committed to obeying the Lord. Protect and nurture this marriage like any other because of this unique opportunity you have with him, or this unique opportunity you have with her. That's what he's saying. They have the association. They might have the association of Christ's body. They would have the example of prayer, of the gospel. They get to hear the gospel. They would come to the service and hear the truth week after week, the truth coming upon them. They would see the power of God working. They would hear the truth. They would see the spirits coming upon people and people ministering to each other. Love taking place. This is what they would see. That's what Jim Simley saw. Jim and Nancy Simley. They attend Master's Bible Church up in Sedona. I came in 2001, January 2001. Jim was unsaved. He'd already been unsaved for quite some time. I was there at Master's Bible Church for almost 6 years. So you're talking 10, 15, 20 years. Jim was unsaved. And yet his wife, Nancy, she loved Christ. And he would bring her week after week, and they'd be sitting there. And he would come and hear the Word of God. You know what happened? It's about 3.5 years ago. I got a phone call. Hey, Jim. It's Jim Simley. I just got saved. He got saved. And I was blown away. What? And he started telling me the story. What happened? He came to Christ. Because Nancy was faithful. She made faithful. She prayed for him. She prayed for him. It's awesome. Don't underestimate the power of God. But there's a negative aspect to this, right? Verse 15. What if the unbelieving one leaves? What if they say, I'm done. I ain't down with this Christian stuff. You're on your own. I'm out of here. What do you do? Let him leave. Or let her leave. The brother or the sister is not under bondage in such cases or in such things. You're not bound. In other words, I believe you cannot make them stay. That's what he's saying. And notice he follows that up with the next statement. But God has called us to peace. That's where you have to be peaceful. You're called to peace. We're called to live in peace. You cannot force that unbelieving spouse, husband, wife to stay with you. And then he says, in verse 16, for how do you know, O wife, whether you will save your husband? How do you know, O husband, whether you will save your wife? Now you can take that one of two ways. You can take a negative or a positive. You never know. You may, by God's grace, take part in him or her coming to Christ. They might not, though. That's the negative way. I take it more of a positive. Some people take a negative, hey, you're not going to save them. I think Paul is explaining this in the positive way. And I'll explain to you the reason why I think that next week as we talk about divorce and remarriage, because Paul's saying, you never know what's going to happen. You never know. He might get saved. She might get saved. I think it's more positive than negative.